It's not on the web or anything at this point. Just no downloads. Just Amazon right now. Just buy the album. But yeah, there'll be more coming because it's a new label. It's just started a new label.
All right, I think we started, man. Yeah. You ready? Yeah, all right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the People's Forum. Thanks for coming. It's Saturday, July 13th, and as a coincidence, the latest installment of Jazz and Self-Determination happens to arrive on the birthday of Brother Albert Ayler. So since the focus of these discussions is focusing on that period of jazz development and its artistic and sociological connections and the sociological connections through the freedom in the music, with the totality of the voices of each person that plays the music coming from their own perspective, but the focus is to get the primaries of the music to define the narrative. And on Albert Ayler's birthday, this is a perfect time to do that, and I'm so appreciative that we were able to be joined today by Mr. Steve Tintweiss, bassist, and Mr. Joel Friedman on cello, who's also been doing some very good films, which I'm sure Mr. Friedman will discuss. So thanks very much for coming. So what we're going to do is start out by talking about the history of each musician, and that's going to lead into their relationship with Albert Ayler. And of course, in the course of that discussion, it's going to touch on the history of the free jazz revolution of the 1960s, the social formations and the groupings of musicians, and thank you. Steve Tintweiss, how are you? Thanks for coming.
Feeling great, Raj. It's good to be here.
Yeah, is your mic on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear okay back there? All right.
Yeah, Steve bought some pictures for us that's serving as a background loop, which are primarily focused on Albert Ayler plus some others thrown in. But the focus today is Mr. Albert Ayler as well. So, but as far as your own history, Steve, you're a native New Yorker originally, right? And how did you get involved in music?
I've been a native New Yorker born originally in Brooklyn, lived in Manhattan and now in Queens. And
what part of Brooklyn were you from, man?
Ocean Parkway, Kings Highway.
Watch the microphone.
So I got into the music originally as a teenager when I started studying bass when I was in high school, and I actually started on baritone horn, but I wanted to play trumpet, but they already had trumpet players, so they threw the baritone horn at me, and then a friend of mine turned me on to some jazz records, Mingus and Paul Chambers. When I heard that bass playing, I said, okay, that's what I want to do, and so I actually studied with three prominent jazz bassists at the time in the 60s, beginning with Steve Swallow, then Gary Peacock, and finally Dave Eisenson. And in the meantime, I became acquainted with some of the things that were going on in the free jazz realm. At the time I was studying with Gary Peacock, he was playing with Miles Davis, and they were playing at the Vanguard, so actually had a couple of lessons at the Vanguard, but he's usually at his apartment. But this was just at the time when he left Miles Davis and went with Albert Ayler. So that was, really impressive to me. I mean, for a bass player to leave Miles Davis to go to Albert Ayler with, who was almost unknown at the time, So I think this was right before one of their tours that were coming up in Europe. And and just listening to records and moving on from from the beboppers, listening to some classical music, and then really getting into the free jazz realm. And I just kind of pursued it. I do a lot of composing and writing, and and before too long, at a young age, I started my own band, the Purple Y, and we managed to play quite a bit in Manhattan, downtown. We took part in this huge. It was at the time the largest demonstration ever in the history of New York, the Mobilization for Peace. There were hundreds of thousands of people, and we went we had our own float. We went from Central Park to the UN, and there were a number of different floats and many marches. Martin Luther King leading it, and Dr. Spock, and so many others. It was, and just so many people lining the streets. It was quite an experience, and I had some really good musicians with me at the time. The late Perry Robinson, Joel Peskin, Marty Cook, and Randy Kay and Lawrence Cook were the drummers, and there were a few other people sitting in. So that's really how I got hooked. And we later actually were invited to play at the Biafra benefit concert at the St. Mark's Church. And we were really the only jazz group on the bill. It was a 2-day bill. There were a lot of well-known names that were playing on this benefit, and there was people like Richie Havens, Country Joe McDonald and the Fish, and many others, very well-known people. And so I sort of, and with the style of music that I was composing at the time, it was free jazz, but we also had some vocal lyrics, and the style was a lot different than what was going on at the time. So somehow we managed to fit in on sets opposite some rock bands and some folk music. I got to jam with Joan Baez in the back while we were waiting to go on, and after that it was just a lot of performances, a lot of great musicians, and eventually, I got asked to do the trip with Albert Ayler in 1970 to the south of France, and yeah. Unfortunately, we can't see the slides, but I've looked at them. We've got about 1,200 slides behind us.
Growing up in Brooklyn, what was your entryway into jazz in general within that context?
Well, I was already living in Queens, and the high school I went to, Newtown High School, which was recently a few years ago shut down, had a very good music program. And so, I got to participate in a large band and orchestra, and studied, pretty seriously once I started playing bass, and just started playing with a lot of musicians that were, a lot of the musicians out in Queens and in the Jamaica area were sort of everyone was in the Coltrane phase at the time. So we were doing a lot of, modal jazz and, kind of developing that way. And, met more and more musicians at the time, and that's really, how it got started.
Right, and you saw Coltrane in person, right?
Oh, I saw Coltrane many times in person.
And what was that experience like?
Very transformative. I remember seeing him do these long sets at the Vanguard, and he had Pharoah Sanders and Eric Dolphy with him, and of course Jimmy Garrison and Elvin Jones, McCoy Tyner. You know, it was one of the best bands probably ever. So that was very inspirational.
Right. And did you play with Albert Ayler ahead of the 1970 performance at St. Paul de Vence?
Just one time. I met Albert Ayler in, I would say it was 65 or 66, at a party that was in Manhattan at a singer, a friend of mine, passed last year, named Judy Stewart.
Right.
And she was friends with Frank Wright. I was playing with Frank Wright's group at the time, and Albert was at the party, so that's where I met him. And then we later got to jam at a 1966, I think, session at Slugs, where it was Burton Green's group, and
that was the clip that was released on the Holy Ghost box set.
yes,
Right.
that was a jam that was released. It was the last tune of the night, and I sat in on Henry Grimes' bass.
Okay.
And Albert sat in. Frank Smith was a tenor player in the group, and he was a real Albert Ayler acolyte. So it was, if anyone who might have heard this on the Albert Ayler box set, the Holy Ghost box set, they were just screaming back and forth, and it was very intense. Rashid Ali was on drums, and I actually broke the G string on Henry's bass, but you know, you can't really hear the bass unless you use headphones on that. But that was the first time that I played with Albert.
I see, yeah. How was Albert regarded within the free jazz community? And I should clarify that that community is not separated from the jazz totality, but I guess certain directions in music are probably formed by informal groupings of people, even if that's not the intention. But how was Albert regarded within that sector of jazz?
You actually have to look at it by the style and by the sector. There you go. At that time, there was a lot of animosity among the straight-ahead jazz musicians and the post-bebopers. Most of them didn't really care for what the free jazz players were doing because, they were abandoning the style and playing on changes and so forth. So there was a lot of tension. There were very few, there were some, but there were very few musicians who would play both and, would cross over. So Albert was not well regarded by the musicians or the critics at the time. Those who were into free jazz, saw immediately what an innovator and pioneer he was. But he had it rough. It wasn't acceptable at all. Yeah.
What about today? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, bring it up a little closer, yeah.
Closer.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Is that working? I can't tell from
Yeah.
out here. What about today? Is there any animosity, or what do you think?
Well,
Not animosity, just lack of understanding.
Yeah.
How's that? Oh, is that very good? I hope that's very good. Yes, thank you very much, yes. Children
Okay.
of the night.
So what was the question you were asking?
Yeah.
Yeah,
The question
thanks.
was. the question was, what's going on today? Do you think there's animosity or lack of understanding today, or what?
I think it's improved a lot because it's become a more accepted style within, the greater jazz community I'd say in general, but there's still a lot of resentment among the traditionalists, because even in the schools that have jazz programs, they're, at least here in America, they're not too fond of exposing their students to the freeform jazz styles because they want to concentrate more on having them be able to make a living, if possible, once they graduate. So among the musicians themselves, it's a lot better, but there's still some divide, but it's not anything like it was back then when it was real animosity.
How back then, do you remember how the animosity was expressed? Was it, I mean, I'm just curious because I had certain experiences, but I'm not going to share them at the moment, but yeah.
Well, it was...
Were you into fist fights?
No. Well, I wasn't, but there were a few incidents that Burton Green could tell you about where he got slugged in slugs.
Well, you're supposed
by a
to.
well-known trumpet player.
Okay, we've been joined by Joel Friedman, cellist, who spent some time playing live and recording with Albert as well. But to preface your involvement with Albert, what was your beginnings of music? And you're a native New Yorker as well.
Well, I was born in New York.
Matter.
Yeah, and
Not that it matters.
till age 10, I was born at a very young age.
Everyone is born.
But I lived in the city until I was 10. Then my folks unceremoniously dragged me up to Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. So one of the little river towns about 18 miles up, and it was pretty stifling actually. That growing up, I think my dad figured, well, it was going to be kind of open, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I didn't know what it was, but I started in 4th grade up there. We made the transition, and then in 4th grade also, there was some good things that happened. Though I'm going way back now with my background, but the school had a number of orchestras, and so they wanted to throw me into the orchestra. I wanted to play trumpet. No. I want to play drums. No. Here, this is a cello. Play it. That was it, man. Right. It was forced labor, So, in any event, so I got into the orchestra, and that was a little 4th, 5th grade orchestra. It was okay playing, and they were playing some fairly good stuff. They had a high school orchestra, which was really great. I mean, that orchestra was really something else. But so I worked my way up that ladder, and let's put it this way: at a certain point, about a year or two into it, I started studying privately with a woman named Francesca Church, and she was quite a cellist, and she lived near the school, and she was a performing artist. But the one thing that distinguished her playing also was that she'd been a student of Pablo Casal's. Mm-hmm. She was a student of Casal's, and she was in his master class. And so right now, I continue with my cello. Live in Westport, Connecticut, and I continue to teach folks, and I teach, I won't go into I'll keep it chronological, but in any event, I do say, and people say, well, it's like, twice, what do they say? From, what's his name, Bacon? Mm. Yeah. You know what how many generations, three times removed from Casal, so you study with me,
Well, how did that lead to your involvement with jazz as a player?
It didn't.
Okay.
It didn't. What happened was I developed my cello playing, and I started winning awards when I was 6, 7 years old. I mean, 6th, 7th grade, rather. And so I got into that, but there was a friend of mine who started playing music. His name was Jonathan Eberhardt. He was, just as we moved into high school, he was playing some jazz stuff, starting with this more traditional stuff. And I liked it. It was kind of good music. We went into New York. He said, come on, let's go check something out. So I was about 15 at that time. So went to New York to catch somebody named Miles Davis at the Birdland. Somebody named, and it was a fantastic experience. I didn't expect it. So there was a guy who was introducing that, introducing Miles. His name was Pee Wee Marquette, and he was now we have here at Birdland the great, the wonderful, the extraordinary Miles Davis. And there it was, man. Everybody's clapping. I'm sitting in the peanut gallery, man. You could have a Coca-Cola. But I didn't know what was going on. And I heard Paul Chambers start off. Dum, ba-dum, dum, ba-dum, dum. I said, what the hell? This is unbelievable, man. This is something else. And so Chambers was cooking away. And So What came in, and Miles started playing. I went, wow, man, that was it for me. I was done. I wanted to play bass. So I was playing cello and I studied bass. I went to study bass. I studied with I first studied with a guy named, they call him Mr. Z, Fred Zimmerman. Mm-hmm. And I took lessons with Fred and down on 55th Street. Right. And Fred was teaching bass, and I said, wow, this was something else. Fred Zimmerman was an amazing, amazing teacher. Mm-hmm. He got me into the jazz thing, really, because he showed me real technique on the bass, the German bow, how to do pizzicato. Mm-hmm. And that was through a classical method, using the book called Samandel, which he edited. It was his book. Yeah. Anyway, that's the beginning.
Bible for bass players.
Well, it was. Now, I have a funny story. I left Fred's for a lesson. I had my bow a German bow in a case. I walk across 55th Street, and there's this man standing next to me. He looks at me, "What you doing?" he says. I said, I'm just out from a lesson. "You got a bass?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Who are you studying with?" "I'm studying with Fred Zimmerman." "You studying with Mr. Z?" He says, "You got the Bible under your arm and you're studying with the Lord." I said, "He was Teddy Wilson, the pianist. He was Teddy Wilson." I didn't know it. Wow. I said, "Yeah. Yeah, man." He says, "What's happening?" I said, "You're a musician." He said, "Yeah, I'm a musician, all right." He said, later found out who he was. I just about dropped my... And it's Teddy Wilson. He said, "Why don't you come by somebody and catch me out now?" I said, "Where are you playing?" "Oh, across the street, Birdland, man." I said, "Wow, I don't know what's going on here," but it was wild.
I remember those early days. The original Birdland was quite unique. They would have that back section, all the way in the back, where they let you come in even if you were underage, and so it was great. That's another place where I caught Coltrane, but it was very smoky in there. People could smoke in the clubs at the time, but what a great experience. And I met Alan Grant, who used to have a radio program, jazz program, and he was leading the youth matinees on the weekends at Birdland, so I got to play there a few times. But
that's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, it's
the
really
original
something.
Birdland, that was really
right. He broadcast on WABC as well, right? I believe.
a few stations.
A few stations,
and then he wound up going to Las Vegas and establishing the Monday Night Jazz at the Four Queens, which was on public radio for about 15, 16 years.
Now, Joel, when did you meet Albert Ayler?
Oh, well, we have to jump ahead. We have to go
Jump
way
back
many years, man.
Forward,
You got to jump back. I met him. It's a big jump for me. I was playing cello in high school. Then I was playing cello in various orchestras, and studying bass and starting to play jazz. And there were a lot of cats around where I was playing who wanted to play. So, just a little background. I decided to set up a little club, my own club, in my parents' house. And every Saturday night, about one Saturday night or two Saturday nights, usually once a month, I'd have people come down. Well, it was unbelievable. There was a guy who was a terrific drummer named Steve Gordon, and he kind of took me under his wings. And he was into heavy jazz. And then one night, there's a guy named Vinnie Ruggiero came in. He was studying with Philly Joe Jones. Right. And Ronnie Cuber came in and playing baritone. I mean, Bobby Porcelli was coming in one night on saxophones. Guys came, Frankie Marable, Butch Jones was a big, strong guy. He came in with Frankie. he said, I work my job during the day. I said, well, Butch, where you work? Oh, I work in the prison, man. I work in the prison laundry. And people, during the day, people had all these different gigs, but at nighttime they were really playing. Frankie Marable he sounded like Paul Chambers. He was really something.
And Albert was one of the people that
No,
attended these
nothing.
sessions?
Albert wasn't on the scene at all.
Okay.
I think Albert was still. That would be the late 50s, man. That's
Okay.
I'm an old cat, man. I'm one of the old guys.
When did you meet Albert?
Don't push me, man. Don't push me. Okay, you want to know about Albert? I'll jump. Okay.
Yeah, we'll jump
I
to
had been.
different points.
We got plenty of time to talk.
Yeah,
so
we're gonna
I'm
go
giving you
back
the
and forth.
interior background. You can weed out all the crap that you want to. I don't care.
No, man.
So what happens is, I had been very active in the civil rights movement. When I went to NYU, I became very active and went on freedom rides and all that kind of things, and got beat up. But I was playing bass at the time, and at a certain point, I kind of switched over to cello a little bit because I wanted to have a melody instrument. Bass, I loved playing bass. I played in big bands. I played but I was really I wanted a melodic instrument, so I started playing cello, jazz cello. And there was a guy named Fred Katz who was with Chico Hamilton.
Oh, yeah.
And so I listened to Fred Katz. There weren't too many jazz cellists around, man. They weren't. So I started playing. Perry Robinson, the clarinetist, was playing. There was a place we called it the Jazz Triangle.
Yeah.
It was the triangular building off 7th Avenue.
Yeah.
And so a lot of cats. Bill Fowle on bass. You know Bill.
Yes.
Bill was there. I mean, and then the guy came in. At one point, he started to play with a guy named Warnett. His name was Charlie Moffett, the drummer. He was the most beautiful dude in the world. He was just a really wonderful, warm human being. I miss Charlie. He taught me a lot. Anyway, all the cats came into play, and I was getting the chance to start to stretch out on the cello a little bit then. So now I'm into the time. It was be in 64, 65, somewhere around there. Long time ago. Again, the sands of time. So I'm with my girlfriend on Bedford Street, waking up on a Sunday morning, I think it was, yeah. The phone rings. She says, there's some guy on the phone. He says he's Albert. You know Albert? I said, I don't know Albert. He said, well, he wants to talk to you. Pick up the phone. I'm kind of tired. And it's must have been about 11 or 11:30, 12 o'clock. Joel Friedman. I can imitate his speech, but I might get called out and beaten up by some guys, man.
I doubt it, man.
Oh well. Well, I remember it because it was like, said, you Joel Friedman? Yeah. I be Albert, man. I be Albert. We're playing I heard you playing at the Triangle up there, man. I said, yeah. You did. What do you play? Oh, I play. So I didn't know a thing about Albert Ayler. Did you? I didn't know a thing about it. I never heard of him. And he said, yeah, I've been doing this little gig, man, up today over at the little place, the Village Gate, man. The Village Gate. I caught Train at Village Gate when Train was really coming in with Miles. I caught Aretha Franklin there at her first debut in New York. It was unbelievable. So here's this guy on the phone. I said, well, okay. Am I going too slow? Should I go faster? Should I speed it up? Faster. So
No, go ahead. It's fine.
so what happens is he said, I heard you playing up there, man. We want to come and play this gig today, man. I said to myself, what the hell? Village Gate, Jesus, I had no idea, but I knew it was a big deal. He said, yeah, I don't know your music, man. I have to tell you, I never heard your music. And he says, well, that's okay, no problem, man. That's not a problem. Just come on down. Well, can we? I said, well, can I hear something? Can we do a rehearsal? Can I hear a little of your music? Why, sure, man. I'll do a rehearsal. Meet me on McDougal Street, man. And in about an hour, we hit about 2 in the afternoon, man. So meet me on McDougal Street, and we can go over, where am I gonna meet you? In front of the Cock and Bull, man, near the Cafe Wa. So I'm standing there with my cello. It's kind of chilly. And I see this cat walking down the street, kind of not a tall guy, but next to him was Donald, his brother. And he comes walking out, and he has one of those little Russian hats, little triangular hats, little coat. He says, Joel Friedman? I said, yeah, I be Albert. I said, Albert Ayler? Yeah, nice to meet you, man. Yeah, he introduced me to his brother Donald. He said, we should get you on playing a little music, you know. Where are we going to do it? He said, right there. He pointed to right, and he put me. We walked down an alleyway, and I sat on the garbage can, man. I sat on the garbage can, and he held up the music, and I said, okay, man. I didn't know I could kind of get a feeling for it. I mean, I kind of like it was kind of, what the hell? This is written. He put this stuff down. This is pretty wild. He was very sweet. He had an air of total sweetness and calm, man. I mean, he was a guy you just loved him right away. I mean, it was love, and really, this is spiritual. But it was like, yeah. Later, I came to understand it was spiritual. He was in touch with something. Really, no kidding, folks. He was really somebody. He was somebody. So he said, "Okay, let's go, man." Okay, and we walk around the corner, and I looked, and I can't believe it. There's these two huge vans in front of recording vans. They're like these trailer trucks with recording. And he said, "Yeah, oh Joe, yeah, they're doing some kind of side, some kind of some kind of record, something, you know." Well, that what is that, Impulse?
Yeah.
Yeah, they had these two big trailers out there, guys throwing cables and wires. I said, "Oh shit, I'm into some trouble. I'm going to be in real trouble here. I'm fucked. Maybe I can I got to go to the bathroom or something." No shit. I was scared. Come on, that's okay, man. You don't have to know. You're gonna play okay. He was very encouraging, and I didn't know what the hell I was getting into. I was really scared shit. He walks me into the entrance. All kinds of guys, all kinds of musicians, and truth be, I was the only white guy there. There was no other white folks. It was like, now, it was an interesting experience to be a minority like that. And some guy comes walking up, and I kind of recognize him. "Albert, how you doing? How you doing, John? This is my cellist. Right here, he plays my cello, Joel Friedman. It's John Coltrane." Now I'm ready to shit my pants right there. I'm telling you, no kidding. It was really, I was like, "Oh yeah, it's nice to meet you. Yeah, man, how's it going?" Whew. I mean, seriously, this is real trauma for me, because I'd never been in this league anywhere. Around these guys, someone's playing a set, and you kind of amble next to Monk or someone, say, "Oh, that's nice, man. That'd be it." But to have to be approached, I'm Albert's cellist. I haven't played one note with the freaking guy. What am I doing, man? So we go in, and when we got up, there were two lines in the front of recording engineers, just all the way down, and people. The place was packed. This is for the Black Arts Theater, for Leroy Jones, later known as Amir Baraka. And I never met the guy, but I eventually did at one point. But this is for his theater, and it was a good deal. I said, "Fine, I'm in the right place, man." But I wasn't. But what is the music I'm going to play? Well, when we got up there, and he just counted off. He just started playing, and it was like he was playing. I couldn't believe the amount of sound. I mean, the cello I had all these mics on the cello too, but he didn't even need a mic. He blew. You could hear. I mean, the sound coming around was like I never heard anything like. I really never heard anything like that in my life.
Joel, I was at that concert. At that, it was really an event.
You were there? You mean you were a white guy? You were a white guy in the audience? Oh, you were in the audience? I couldn't see you, man. I couldn't see you. I'm still telling the truth, man. Of the musicians, of the musicians.
It was a historic occasion. I mean, there were, besides Coltrane's group and Albert Ayler, there were other groups that, that all came out on that record. And
Right.
I got to meet Eric Dolphy. He was in the audience too.
Yeah, man.
Talking with him, but that was quite being thrown into the pool there.
I was thrown into the pool. I didn't know who else was in the pool.
Right. Did you play you remember playing at the beginning or the middle of?
It was near the beginning, man. And,
right.
And Albert just started off like a roar, man. It was like a sheet of, I don't know, like a sheet of sound, like a wave, and he started off, and you can hear it on the album. He's cooking away.
Yeah, and speaking of that, was there more music from that particular set? Because there's just a 7-minute track, which is very
It's compact.
one of the most fiery 7 minutes in the history of the new music. But was the set was longer, I gather?
No, it wasn't.
No, okay.
Because Albert, if anybody tried to cut the music, that's when he would have, said, "No, you really can't do
Okay.
that."
Was the set longer than 7?
No.
No, it wasn't.
No, it
okay.
was about 8 minutes, 9
8
minutes.
minutes, okay.
It's the longest. But when he finished his solo, he looked at me, and I just jumped in. I just felt it. It was like getting a bolt of lightning up my ass, man. He was just boom.
Right.
And I was playing. I did what I did. You hear it on the, and he was totally inspiring. And when I was playing, I forgot about everything. He put me in the zone within about 3 seconds.
And what was it like playing in tandem with Sonny Murray at that time, who, along with Rashid Ali, I think they were the two, and later Beaver
I gotta
Harris, who
tell you,
started playing the drums without a fixed
I don't know
movement.
where the hell I was. I mean, I was.
Yeah.
They put me in some place. I don't know. It was like being backed up, by a freight train, man.
Yeah.
Sonny Murray, and he only had three fingers in one hand, something like
Right.
that. I was looking and said, "What the hell is this guy, man?" He's playing. I can't express enough how amazing it was. And I felt when I was done with that, I felt I was hanging out with everybody, and they were all patting me on the back and all that kind of stuff. I felt my self-esteem went up 3,000%, man. Albert didn't spare anything, and I've never felt that kind of praise. Not just being supported by a musician. He was warm. He was beautiful. It was natural. It was I went from total fear to like saying, "Wow, this is great." So Albert took me on other gigs, and I was his cellist at least for about 1.5 years, 2 years. The Astor Theater, we did that Astor Theater. We did a whole bunch of things, and what was it? The Fillmore East, I guess, was one. They recorded that, I believe.
When it was the Village Theater.
Village Theater, yeah. It was
Right. I was about to ask you that. It was about 1.5 years in total following the Village Gate performance that you played live with Albert.
Right.
And some of the venues, as you said, was the Astor Street Playhouse. And,
Yeah, I mean, it was.
Did you play Slugs as well?
Yeah, Slug was happening. It was a short little thing. I think it was Slugs because some kind of fight or something broke out and decided to leave.
Sorry, that's good. Man.
Yeah, and there was things. Slugs, it was Slugs, man. It was a heavy. It was and if you weren't an African American dude, you might really get slugged. Just get into some fight with some crazy person.
Oh,
or
okay.
something. So,
Comes down to that every now and then, but
I mean,
in that 1.5 years that you played with Albert, who were the other band members in the ensembles? Was it did it stay intact?
It moved
Similar
around.
to
It
the,
moved around. It moved around. I could make a list of people, but it was more than 1.5 years because he came back. Then he had Michelle Sampson playing with him, who was a violinist. And following that, then he did some gigs. I don't remember all the different gigs. He did a town hall gig, I believe, and he did a whole bunch of things. And he called me every now and then. It was like an arbitrary, and then Charles. Charles Tolliver, yeah. Tyler, right. And so he wanted me to play with him, and then that was when Charlie Moffett was playing.
That's this recording.
Yeah. That was a lot of fun. I mean, started doing recordings. Some of them were released, and a lot of them weren't released. Just really weird. Bernie Stallman came in, and he was an interesting person, Bernie. People had different opinions of him. I think he may have ripped a lot of people off one way or another. I don't know. All I can say is I think he played a very pivotal and important role, no matter what he was doing, in getting people recorded and out, whether he was making money for himself on it. And you know what? I don't even think he was into that. I don't think he was like pulling anything on people. I think he really believed in the music. I didn't know the guy. I mean, I spent a little time with him, but
Even the way those recordings were packaged, it was art in every aspect of the.
Well, he
Of
seemed to
the
be. He seemed to be.
production.
He was real. You weren't getting that.
You know.
And the music, you were not, definitely not getting that in any other real form. In Europe, Albert started traveling Europe, but in Europe, it was a whole different thing. The people loved the music. In fact, I was traveling and we went to Paris, and Sonny Murray was playing with a bunch of people in a cave. You know, it was like a basement play. It was like a club in the basement.
Right, Le Cave.
A cave, yeah. And the music was really moving along. People were really starting to love it, man. And Europeans just ate it up, man. They just loved it. The United States, you couldn't get arrested, man. I mean, you know, the shows that we did, there were usually very few people attending, you know.
Let me say something about Bernard Stallman. When he started ESP, and the first record actually he was interested in something called Esperanto, but the Albert Ayler Trio with Sonny Murray and Gary Peacock was the first official release. I believe he really had the best of intentions, even
I think so.
business-wide. The business model he started with was very unusual. Each of the musicians, including all the sidemen, owned a specific portion. For instance, I recorded the Patty Waters Sings album, and so I owned 1/6 of it.
I forgot to bring that one.
Yeah, and then unfortunately, because you know these weren't really bestsellers or anything, even within the jazz field, you know, to continue to stay in business as a record company, at one point he brought in a manager who kind of forced all the musicians to take a very inexpensive $7,500 or something like that
That's right,
payoff to get out of their contract. I never did sign that, but
I didn't
but
either.
it had started off with good intentions, but it's true that you know the money never came to the musicians that it was supposed to get, you know, at least a certain expectation. But you know, it's certainly historical in terms of without ESP-Disk, there wouldn't have been the kind of worldwide exposure to this kind of music.
You know, and I'm not trying to defend Bernie because I really don't know what happened. People were beefing about him and bitching about him. I got $100 or something, and you know, recorded some more. He had more stuff to record. I don't know what happened to it, but the reality of business was that he wasn't making any money on those sides, no matter how far he went. He just couldn't have been. And I say that because my other hat that I wear now, I started wearing it a few years when I went to NYU Film School and did music, and then I got into films. It was documentary films and independent films. You didn't make a thing on it, man. You put your money and your heart into it, and you know, nothing came out of it. And distributors, well, if you got one, if you're lucky to get one, they do a deal. You know, well, you got 50% after someone builds a swimming pool or something. You know, you just, you know, making independent films, independent records was just. I think he had a vision. It didn't happen that way. That's all. And when you lose a lot of money, that hurts. I don't know. Now, I don't know his particular situation. Maybe he was ripping people off. I don't think he was the kind of guy that. I met him years ago before he passed, I guess. And he said, "Hey, you want to do an album with cello?" I said, "Sure, man, let's do it." You know, he was still wanting to dive in. Mm-hmm. He looked like he could barely stand up at that point. I mean, really. And so I never harbored any bad feelings to him, even though people who I trusted and did not like him at all. But who would have done that? He did the Fugs also, didn't he?
Right.
The Fugs. He took a lot of chances, and I don't think anything really paid out.
Yeah, the interesting thing about ESP in particular, which is where the world first heard the sounds of the both of you, was that it pretty much represented the second or third wave, maybe second of so-called free jazz players, where the originators of that style were coming through a straight line via so-called bebop. And the language that the ESP documented was coming out of that as
Right.
part of the tree with the branches, but it also seemed to retain a lot of
Oh, go ahead and say
cultural
it.
information, cultural retention, where you're speaking through sound,
Right.
and extended techniques, which are not new. Sounds that come from a lot of spiritual worship in black culture and
Yep.
and around the world, basically, in reference to concepts that predate religion, that are more indigenous to any person that predate the use of religion as a tool to was an instrument of free labor. But aside from that,
I think it was particularly endemic to
what were some of the formations of musicians that formed around that time that you played with, Joel? And then I'll ask Steve the same question, because this all leads back to Albert going in and out of the circle, and
Right.
these discussions sort of document that history. You jumped in at that point. What formations do you remember playing with yourself? Because I know there's a session by the British trumpeter Rick Colbeck and a couple of other things with Bill Dixon.
Yeah, I
Other
mean, I
kind of-
played with Bill Dixon. He was a terrific trumpet man. He was really, really good player, really terrific player. And I hadn't, it brought out a lot of people like Bill. Is this still, I can't hear any feedback, so it's working. Bill Dixon was a wonderful guy. In fact, you do so many concerts. I don't remember everything, but I played a bunch of stuff with him. One I remember was he asked me to come to a dance concert with a woman named Yvonne Rainer. And Yvonne Rainer, she was something, and it was at NYU. What do you get out of that? And yeah, she was, and it was at NYU in the Loeb Student Center. It was a large theater there, and he just said, "Come on in, man." He was in one end of the theater, and I was at the other. I don't know if it was recorded, but it would have been great because somebody must have done something with it. But she was dancing to that. It was improvised dancing, and it was and we did a bunch of things with different dancers and so on. It was a great time. It was an incredible time in Soho, and an incredible time in music and in theaters. Soho just started bursting with energy and with dance and with films and this guy. I mean, just to give you an idea, you don't know what's going on at the time because it's like that. This guy said, I caught one of his things of music. And he said, "Well, I want you to play some cello. Now, can you do this music?" And he showed me a little. Yeah, sure, no problem. Phil Glass said, "Come and play." Now, that's Phil Glass before he was Phil Glass, right? You know what I mean? There are people before they were people, before they were, oh, man. Yeah. Now, he's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant composer. I love his music. But, there's a time where everybody was just hanging out. And music-wise, not just music-wise, I was asked, my then wife became friends with a person, Dorothy, and she was friends with, there was just a change of people. Somebody said, "Oh, there's a guy named Roy Lichtenstein. He wants you to come. He wants to see some of your films, and hear some of your music." Yeah. So that happened. I met this guy. I didn't know who he was. He's a nice guy. He's really sweetie, real sweetie, and he had just bought a. I didn't know he had bought it, but he was a bank building on the corner of Spring and Bowery. It was
Right.
Pardon?
Right.
I don't know who had the deed to it, but I just knew
And
about that. The Mizell.
okay.
Okay.
And what are your memories
Roy,
of the?
I know he had put some dough into it. So in any event, maybe who owned it? I thought he did, but
And what are your memories of doing the session with trumpeter Rick Colbeck at that time? Because it was a very important lineup. I believe it was yourself, Benny Maupin,
yeah.
Lancaster,
Right, Byard, yeah.
Cerrone on bass, and
It was-
yourself, and
Now, I
Sonny
want to know
Sharrock.
something. I think you're becoming the king of the historic.
I'm not.
historians.
I'm with
I
the
don't
people.
know, man. I know. I know. No, I know. There's no. It's okay. No, you don't have anybody there. There are peons working in your field yet, but you will. No, Rick was a terrific trumpet player. There's a lot of guys who came out of that. He was terrific. I think he passed on when.
He sometime in the late '70s, early '80s.
Yeah,
He had stopped playing.
He was a really terrific player. He was getting it. He was getting into it. I don't know what happened to. We did recordings and stuff. I don't know what happened.
Right.
But that Charlie Moffett was in one of those too. And I'm trying to remember all the different. Man, people were moving around like all over the place.
And this session in particular, you recorded with Charles Tyler in the studio for ESP Records, which we're discussing right now. How did that happen? And did you perform in live performance with Charles Tyler as well?
I probably did. Because I was more familiar with his music. I didn't walk into it as a cold session.
Right.
I was certainly familiar with the way Charles Moffett played. And the thing about Charles Moffett also was particularly, but most of the cats, there was no ego involved. He's playing stuff. He's playing bells, or he's playing trumpet, or he's not trumpet. He's playing drums, or whatever he's playing. And he was just trying to push you along. He was integral to the music. He wasn't trying to dominate anything, which was he had the skill to come up underneath, and he'd been playing with Ornette, right?
As a drummer, he blended with his dynamics as a whole.
Well, he did. He was not into like playing a solo. When he did play a solo, it was a beautiful solo because he had total control and confidence in what he did. But what he did when he was playing, if he was behind you, you were just getting that beat, and he was pushing you along and asking you to do certain things that you didn't even know you could do.
And you played a lot with Charles Moffett in live performance.
Yes, yeah, I did a lot with him.
Right.
There was also a guy, maybe you know of him, Martin Siegel. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Marty Siegel was a pianist.
Right.
In fact, we played, I don't remember where we played. We played with Charlie Bar Phillips at Carnegie Recital Hall. Do you know about that one?
I've read about it.
It was recorded. I know that Carnegie Recital Hall, Bar Phillips. And there was maybe one other person, and Marty Siegel played piano. And his wife was Cleopatra. It was Cleo.
Okay.
You're jogging my memory, man.
Okay.
It goes way back. Now, when I was with Charlie Parker, that was a long time before that.
Right.
You're taking me back to my former life.
Beautiful. And Steve, you could answer the same, and this will loop back to Albert, but your memories of the different formations of people that you played with pretty extensively as well at that time.
With ESP, one of the, really the movement that it started, I think a lot of it had to do with their slogan, only the musicians decide. So these recording sessions, there was no A&R, there was no direction other than what the musicians wanted to play or what the band leader wanted to play. So that was one of the reasons why the record sounded so different, because there was absolutely no commercial pressure. There was no stylistic edicts. The musicians they could play whatever they wanted to, what they had been developing. And I think in a lot of ways that was maybe a very early development in encouraging musicians to eventually take control of their own business affairs, to start to produce their own events and maybe even start their own independent labels to get their music out. And so I think that was one of the long-lasting influences. I got introduced to ESP when I was 19. Patty Waters was asked to. No. Yeah. There are some pictures of Patty Waters that will come up. There's almost 1,200 photos there in the slideshow.
And
so I was working with Burton Green at the time, and we were actually pretty lucky because Burton was a real hustler, so we got a lot more gigs than most of the free jazz groups at the time, relatively speaking. And so Patty Waters was asked to do this recording, and we did it with Burton Green on piano, Tom Price on drums, and myself. And that was my introduction to ESP. It was quite an experience. Patty Waters was a true, and it still is, a true innovator. And one of my, memories of that recording session was the musicians were on one end of the room, and on the other far end of the room was a traditional sound booth. And Patty was in the sound booth, and it had a window, and it had like a pink light. And at one point, when Patty Waters was doing her screaming and really getting intense, and she was flailing her arms, and she almost knocked over the sound booth. So that caught our attention, but of course we just kept on playing. This was the what became later a kind of famous version of "Black Is the Color of My True Love's Hair." So that was the first record I did for ESP, and then one of the albums that Ross brought was Burton Green Trio on tour. ESP had managed to get this tour of New York State colleges in 1966, and there were a number of groups on the tour, including Sun Ra, and Giuseppe Logan had a nice group, and Burton Green and Patty Waters, and Rand Blake playing solo piano, and a few others. And we toured at 6 different upstate New York colleges. That was all recorded, and a lot of that material is still available and has been released. Then later on, I did a recording session with Frank Wright called Your Prayer that we did on an Easter Sunday, which I was very happy that the way that turned out. Richard L. Aldenson was the engineer, and we were playing. He came in late, but we were kind of warming up and just jamming until he got there. And then we did one short sound check, and I remember going in and saying, well, could you boost the bass a little bit? And he did that, and so I was really happy with the way that album came out. So I was supposed to record another album with Jim Zitro, had a really nice group that I was working with, Bert Wilson on saxophone, and Warren Gale on trumpet, Michael Cohn on piano, and Zitro was quite a character. And we were playing a lot on the Lower East Side, which is where most of the musicians lived at the time. And at that point, I decided not to do the record because I hadn't gotten paid for the Frank Wright record. So, I got a little gun shy on that. But, through the years, there were a lot of things. I actually remember the last time I saw Bernard Stallman was at the first and what turned out to be the only annual Albert Ayler Festival, which was on Roosevelt Island here in New York City.
Right.
And so that was sponsored by ESP, and it was really to honor Albert Ayler, who was really the flagship artist on ESP as far as the jazz side is concerned. And actually, the only playing I got to do was at the end. We had a little hastily formed jam session. I didn't have a bass with me. I just had my melodica. But so we got to do a little jamming on Roosevelt Island. And unfortunately, that annual Albert Ayler Festival was just a one-time event.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
And the Frank Wright session in particular, Your Prayer, you were playing with Frank Wright regularly live at the time as well.
We did a few performances.
Yeah.
I hadn't been with him too long.
'Cause that recording really exemplifies the spirit of the time.
Yeah. Well,
At that time.
that was an LSD record, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, except Jack Corsell was the only one who hadn't imbibed.
Okay.
And so Muhammad Ali on drums, Rashid's brother,
Right.
and
Arthur
Arthur Jones
Jones.
on alto saxophone, contributed a great tune called The Lady, and Frank Wright, myself, and it was a very intense event.
Hmm. And you also had the distinction of hold on, we do a Q&A. Yeah, we also had the distinction of doing a recording with Burton Green for Columbia Records when they were taking a quick interest in free jazz, which is an interesting moment in this history we're discussing.
Yeah.
And a recording actually arose from that, which unfortunately I forgot to bring.
That
with
was
the quartet. How did that arise in general and for a major label?
that was a John Hammond project. John Hammond, the very well-known producer who had spent years with Columbia introducing many, many artists, integrating bands, and from early on and then even later on getting into introducing some pop or rock or folk artists, I guess you had Bob Dylan at the time, for instance. So John Hammond actually wanted to record Albert Ayler, and he had a small budget to, for some reason Columbia was interested in, they didn't really have any free jazz represented on their label. So when they couldn't come to terms with Albert Ayler, they just, as Albert would say, the money wasn't strong enough. He asked Burton Green to do a session and Sonny Murray to do a session. Sonny's session was never released for reasons which I really won't go into.
Okay,
here.
that's good.
But the session with Burton Green, with Barry Lancaster on saxophones and flute, and Shelley Rustin on drums, was was quite an event. They actually advertised it in the Schwann catalog at the time, in the center page. They advertised it like a rock band for some reason. They put us on opposite NRBQ up in Boston, and so they made a real attempt, and it was also one of the very early records to utilize Moog synthesizer. Robert Moog came in and showed Burton Green how to use one of his early synthesizer prototypes, which was later, there was some overdub on that record to introduce the synthesizer. So that was, like a one-time event that, here it is, Columbia Records at the time.
Wow, and that was interesting. John Hammond initially had an interest in recording Albert.
Yes.
And that leads into what I was going to ask Joel, actually, because at a certain point there was some changes, even though I'm probably one of the people that are of the opinion that all of his musical output had something to offer. But there was some changes in the dynamics, and he recorded New Grass, I believe Love Cry first and then New Grass, which saw him joining in on what was happening at the time, the hybrid, quote-unquote, popular music synthesized with creative music, similar to what Miles was doing, even though Miles's approach was basically avant-garde, which there's a lot of denial about, but not to go off the track.
Well,
But what do you remember, looping it back to Albert, what do you remember about those changes? Because you were playing with him for a year and a half, right? So what happened in that musical relationship in reference to those changes?
You know what? I couldn't respond to that. I don't remember the changes.
Okay.
I know that Albert.
Use the mic, brother.
Oh yeah.
Thank
I
you.
knew. I knew that there were a lot of changes, also personnel changes.
Yeah.
But after that year and a half, then Albert did a few concerts and came back to me on that, and then he would come back to me on a date or something, and then. But I was less prominent. Michelle Sampson had come into his life, and
Okay.
Michelle was really doing some good stuff. He's a terrific player. I think he became a professor down in music professor down in Texas. Did he not?
Knoxville, I think.
Knoxville.
Yeah.
Classical violinist.
Classical
Right.
violinist. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he really took off though.
Right.
Is he still around doing that?
Yes, he is still around. Yeah.
Good for him.
And
We should put together.
It's-
we should put
it-
the
yeah.
the
It
new
was-
age old folks.
Yes, it's very good. I remember Albert and I, son of a gun. Yes, indeed.
that's funny.
It was actually
it was
a contractual pressure on Albert. He had gotten this relatively big contract with Impulse, and Bob Thiel was the producer, I believe. And so their idea was for Albert to record a more rock or pop-oriented set to adapt his playing to that, to see if they could reach a wider audience. So basically, I believe that's really how that got started.
Did that happen? Actually, I wasn't aware of that. Did they release it?
New Grass, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right. That came after. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because that was part of Albert's background in general. So
Right.
you can hear the sincerity in what he was playing in that music, in spite of the circumstances, I guess, because it was already a part of. He had grown up in Cleveland playing R&B music and actually toured with people like Little Walter and Bobby Blue Bland and stuff, and
He played with Lloyd Price, actually.
and Lloyd Price,
Really,
yeah.
as a teenager.
And so Joel, you didn't, after you stopped playing with Albert, did you maintain contact? Did you two maintain contact in a social
Well,
way?
yeah. I mean, there were some times where he and his brother came over to my place, and it would be very impromptu. It'd be the bell would ring, and they'd come upstairs, and first Don would come. Don was particularly interested in some cognac. I had a few bottles of cognac. He liked to drink. And
Yeah.
Albert would just hang out, and I'd make coffee for Albert. We'd talk about music, and I think Albert needed a little space also, just to chill, And I guess 2 or 3 times they came up to my place.
Right.
And I never asked him what he was doing, where he was going, or anything. I just provided him a place to be,
Right.
mental sanctuary, And I think he needed. There was some time. It felt like he was maybe on somewhat of a burnout for a while.
And what do you think are the reasons for that?
I think some of the things you may have touch on, pressures to. It was kind of like money versus his integrity, I think. Being offered money, and that was around that time, asking the record companies and different folks were asking him to do stuff, push him into a more commercial mode. I think they put a lot of pressure on him, because he was pretty broke for a while, and I think, which goes into, there are, and I'm sure there are still many, many, many independent artists who are really terrific in this country, and the humanities and the foundations for the arts really don't recognize them. They recognize the institutions, but not the individual musicians who have something to really, really offer. Who are developing things. That's a sad thing. There are arts commissions in other countries, in foreign countries, and so on, that really provide support for their up-and-coming artists. We don't really have much of that. And I think, some of the Albert, in a certain level, at a certain point, he was neglected. In Europe, people understood how great he was, but here, it never really came to fruition.
So that's not a generalization to say that that the recognition factor was lower in his actual place of birth than abroad. That wouldn't be a gen.
No, I
yeah,
think abroad,
mean,
abroad he really was recognized as being a great artist, and he was given lots of opportunities. But there were other things that entered into it, and I think he just.
yeah.
This is an opinion, but he was such
Yeah.
a great artist. I mean, and he had his own feelings about things. I don't think he had any ego about it. I just think he wanted to continue playing, and some of the great opportunities as he went on in life may not have been there. I'm just guessing. I don't have any, but you can tell by the. Did you find that he was doing as many albums in his later life than?
He was recording for Impulse, but at a certain point his contract was severed. I'm sorry, Steve, what were you about to say?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that's exactly what I was going to feed into.
Yeah.
Was at the point after his later Impulse records came out, and I guess he had never gotten the, a breakthrough into the actual big time, big money pop world. So he really didn't, in the late 60s, he hadn't stopped playing and recording and was just working things out, including a lot of new tunes with his common-law wife, Mary Parks, in Brooklyn. And she wrote a lot of the lyrics, and they collaborated on a lot of new tunes. So it wasn't until Albert Ayler got asked to play at the Meg Foundation in the south of France for their series in 1970 that he really came back on full force. And what's interesting there is, and I got to go with him to France for those concerts, and at that point, Albert sort of went back away from the pop sound that he had been trying to get, or the rock sound, and more into his rhythm and blues and free jazz roots. And the result of that were these award-winning albums. This is Volume 2, Volume 1 at the Make Foundation, 2 versions of it. And his reception there in the south of France was tremendous. The people loved it. We did 2 main concerts and 1 private concert afterwards in the place where we were staying. But it actually made the TV network news in France because of the excitement it engendered. There was also another festival going on around the same time that Archie Shepp and some of the other musicians had played on. And Albert was offered more money to play at that festival, but he would have been restricted. He was told, that if he plays at that festival, then he can't play at the Make Foundation. It's just like a non-compete type of business decision that he had to deal with. So he actually wound up doing the concert series Nuits de la Fondation Marc instead for about half the amount of money. That series was, beautiful, and there were a lot of, great artists. Philip Glass, you mentioned Lamont Young, were sort of in the night before and the night after we had played. Sun Ra and Cecil Taylor had played the season before. And the concert we did was filmed, the whole concert, but it was never released here. So far, I've only seen photos from it, some of which will be on the screen. But there was a full-length movie that was done, that it had been shown in certain locations, universities and movie theaters throughout Europe in the early 70s. But at this point, I believe the only place you can really see it is if you make an appointment to see it at the Meg Foundation. But that was sort of Albert's triumph. And we had many encores the people wouldn't let us off the stage, and the last piece that we did was the live version of "Music is the Healing Force of the Universe," and you know, it was really Albert Ayler's triumph. That was his real acceptance that he had been looking for his whole career.
And did you play with Albert after those performances as well when you got back?
No, Albert only. Well, we did one private concert at the place we were staying. I think it was the next day.
Okay.
And that also is on the Albert Ayler Holy Ghost box set. But when we got back to New York, Albert did do one more concert in Springfield, Massachusetts. That was his last concert. I wasn't on that. It was Leroy Jenkins on violin, no bass player, and unfortunately that was the last. Our piano player, Carl Cobbs Jr., was killed in a hit-and-run accident shortly after that, and then Albert unfortunately met his demise shortly after, with the promise of another step in his career. There were offers of doing concerts in Europe, and the biggest one was in Japan. There was a tour of Japan that was being set up for the following January, but unfortunately Albert never made it.
And Carl Cobbs, I heard about that unfortunate accident. That happened before Albert's passing or after? Well, it doesn't matter, really.
I think it was before.
Yeah, it's okay. And so the next question is, of course, related to what you think might have happened, and it's not to be asked in a sensationalistic way by any means, or because the focus is the art, or on any way that sensationalizes or cheapens his memory, but just the focus of these discussions is that the primaries define the narrative as opposed to by way of. So in reference to, and then I will ask Joel the same question after you answer that. What do you think were the circumstances behind his his
I
passing?
have a feeling maybe I'm off base here. For me personally, I would say that's irrelevant to me personally. I wouldn't even try to attempt that, because his art was so great. Whatever his circumstances, whatever happened, he was such a great man.
Okay.
And they were good circumstances, bad. Death is death, and we lost a great musician. And now, if he was depressed or something, that would be maybe relevant or some other. But you know, we've been delving into his creativity, and I think whatever happened for me, I'm talking personally. I can't, my own feeling is that I don't really give a damn right now, because that's happened, and his music rests with me. I think it rests here when we talk about it.
Exactly. That's what it comes down to. That pretty much sums it up, yeah.
Well, of course, there were a lot of rumors and inconsistent stories at the time. So it's sort of relevant that, you know, such a great artist, and, you know, I wouldn't say there was some like a cult following, but among some of the musicians and the writers at the time, there were all kinds of rumors that Albert had been killed because of another woman, or a drug deal gone bad, or all kinds of stories that he was found in the East River, and that there was stories that he was tied to a jukebox, and you know, just ridiculous types of things, and
that's very
so
bad.
You know, it's
very negative.
Not only negative, but just totally inconsistent. You know,
untrue.
What we do know is that he died by drowning, and he was on a ferry going to not Staten Island, to the Statue of Liberty ferry, and apparently he jumped off. That's, you know, according to Mary Maria Parks, you know, he had left the house in a huff and was very upset. Still, his brother was experiencing a mental breakdown in Cleveland, where his parents and his mother especially, you know, expected Albert to take care of his younger brother, and especially sort of blamed him for bringing him into the music business. And so Albert was very upset. He smashed the television and left, and that was the last that anyone saw of him until Mary had to, identify him in the morgue. So that's what I think happened.
Yeah, and yeah, I can understand that. And in reference to the music, as Joel was saying, the power of the music, Charles Tyler once said one of the most perceptive things about him through his correspondence with Valerie Wilmer for her writings, that he could sense, you can stop me, not in any way to generalize, pathos, is that the right word? You could hear a deep sensitivity, which in a sociological sense can be seen as the hallmark of a lot of spiritual music and the content of what that was about, and the content based on what people were facing, that he had translated that to a newer form of music, the true definition of a cultural dynamic, that it's circular, inspiration from the past to create something new at the same time.
And full of emotion.
He defined it as depression, and I'm hoping that's not limited, not to question Charles Tyler, who would know, and they were compatriots from Cleveland, of course, but not moving away from that topic, as Joel just admonished us, rightfully so, and but the root of what might cause certain feelings in the music, since the creative music has such a strong connection to our feelings and stuff, there might have been something that was present in his sound that indicated a deep
Yeah, and Albert
sadness, depression.
He put so much feeling into the music. Pathos was one of the elements, as well as this great spirituality. But off the bandstand, he was a very even-tempered, thoughtful, mild-mannered guy, and
That's right. That's right.
He wasn't, he wasn't prone to anger or much emotional displays. If you had a conversation with him, or when writers approached him, or anyone really, and there were plenty of people who did when we were in France. He just felt that he never got the understanding that he deserved. That was, a part of it, but he had a very deep spirituality.
Yes, sir.
And he had later expressed it in the Holy Ghost box set. There was some interviews with Albert where he actually quotes scriptures and kind of goes on and delves into that era. But there's one thing I'd like to say about Albert Ayler, that this is the thing, we're talking about him, but unless you heard him play live, you could never really truly understand the power that this man had. His sound was so huge that no matter what kind of situation he was in, you could hear it on the jam of the ear and eye control record on ESP, where even with Roswell Rudd and other players that are played very loudly, Albert just by the force of his playing and his sound just dominated. And they weren't even doing his tunes. It was just a free session for the most part. But if you heard this man play in person, it was just, I've never heard another musician, another saxophonist, or any musician since then that had that power, that sound.
Steve, I have a question for you. You
Use the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, what was it like to play with him, you play with him, and how would it differ from playing with any other band or group or anything? Because you seem to know him better than almost anybody I've met, and you were with him right up through a point of view where he was no longer really playing. So, and you experienced some highs and so on, but playing with the guy, it's like, wow. What was it? What was it like
Well,
for you?
I didn't really spend as much time with him as you did, but it was towards the end, and at that point he had a very developed concept. His songs, his tunes were very strong, and he had some songs with lyrics, but they were thematical pieces, and he really presented himself in a very dramatic way because he could build on the songs that he and Mary Maria had really, played every day practicing together. So it wasn't, at this point, it wasn't like the early days of, more just free, wild improvisation.
Feeling your way through things.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it was that because when we did the concert, I had never rehearsed with him. When he did the concert at the Make Foundation, the first night, the piano player, Carl Cobbs, had missed the plane at JFK, so he didn't arrive until the 2 nights later for the second show. But the first night, we just went out in the woods behind the geodistic dome that was set up at the May Foundation, and the only instructions that Albert Ayler gave, I knew a few of his tunes because I heard him on record, but he just said, well, you start with the bow and then we'll come in from there. And that was it.
So that was your joint on McDougal Street. Same thing. Come on in, man,
Yeah.
and let's do it.
Very similar.
I mean, but then you got in there, and then you just couldn't believe it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the deal.
Well, you weren't
I mean,
familiar with his music at all the first
I
time
didn't
you
know
played
a
with
thing.
him.
I
So
was
I
absolutely
had heard some of his records, so I had a little bit of understanding and heard
a
some
little
of his
bit, but
tunes.
still, it don't mean a thing
Yeah,
to be playing with him or something.
Right, and he
You know,
played tunes that I
may
never
I touch
heard.
you, man? Really? Yeah, you're good, man. That's good. You're beautiful, man. Really. And this man over here is Ross, man. You're doing a great thing here.
Well, I appreciate you guys, man, and the sounds that you made, for quite some time now. And I appreciate, you sitting here talking about Albert and stuff. And what's a conversation about Albert Ayler, of course, as we already know, leads into a conversation about the music that was happening at that time. And so it's not far-fetched to say that the reception of the so-called new music was not what it was to become later, when something that starts out controversial eventually becomes part of the jazz language, even though it's still not as promoted or projected as much as the mainstream end.
Well, I would say that, it's particularly among the saxophone players, just like there was a period where most of the jazz saxophonists were so influenced by Coltrane that they sounded like him, or they tried to.
Yeah.
Among the free jazz players, you could say the same thing right up to this day. The free jazz that's being played, a lot of it goes back to Albert, although Albert had his distinct style, not only in his playing, but in the kind of simple melodies that he often used, and the ensemble approach. So it is different, but the music today is pretty much like just a more refined version of what was going on back then, not just with Albert, but just among the musicians that were starting to develop the free jazz and the whole loft movement that started to enable venues to exist where musicians could get together and develop their art in various combinations. So I don't think Albert's influence has yet been felt to its fullest. I mean, he also, outside of field of jazz, he influenced, other styles of music and some rock groups, Richard Hell, Patti Smith, Diamanda Gallis, and so forth, that were all very much in debt to Albert Ayler.
Right, and that reminds me of two other things you said once about which I'm glad you brought up about his sound. And as great as the recordings are, I believe Amiri Baraka told me that personally numerous times, that he told me one time, he said the record's only rumors. And that he said exactly what you said, is that you had to be there, which of course is the case with the music,
Yeah.
the recordings, which are landmarks as opposed to live performance. But yourself and the people who were there, they said that Albert had an unbelievable sound.
Yeah. Shout out to Milford Graves, who's playing today in Jamaica Arts Center.
Yeah.
And that was just one of the musicians who tells stories about when Albert came over at their place to play, where he put a towel in his horn and he looked up at the ceiling, and as Sonny Murray used to say, he could crack walls, and I guess there might have been a couple instances where the sound was so intense in a small apartment that, it could have started to peel the paint, or it just. Rossi, I can't imagine the sound the man had. The sound was just enormous. Even early on, he got the nickname of Foghorn.
Foghorn. And also, you mentioned something about he used folk themes as a springboard for the intensity of the improvisation, which maybe that example alone is a good component to examine in reference to the stereotypes about that way of playing, and whether or not so-called free jazz, the stereotype of that area of jazz, that it does not contain the same kind of cultural retention that previous forms had, which is probably not a dilemma for musicians.
It even going back to the ensemble approach, it was almost like the early days of jazz, or even pre-Dixieland, where that's the way he approached the music, especially when you were playing with him, Joel. Real ensemble mix, and then he might play 3 or 4 different tunes in one tune.
Right.
He'd mix them and go back and forth between the different themes. Right. When his brother was playing with him, of course, he could pick it up just like that because he was so familiar with it.
So I'm going to ask you on the horn of saxophone. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not used to this thing. Next time, lavalier mics. Lavaliers, you know what I mean? They just pin them on.
Of course.
Who now is there anybody to fill aside from you? Beck, your playing is really great, Ross. I mean,
Well,
I know you love Albert, and and your playing has its own personality to it.
Well, I appreciate that, in spite of what you heard already.
Well, I love what I heard, man. I mean, and I'm honored that you brought me in on some of these things.
Oh, the honor is mutual. And I wanted to ask you, as a person that played with Albert, the fact that he used folk themes as a springboard, themes coming out of different aspects of spiritual, the spiritual component of things.
Right.
Maybe not along the lines of religion so much, but that kind of counteracts the generalizations about the intensity of the so-called free playing. That is still some kind of connection. Did you feel that playing with him, playing those themes in tandem?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and it's his own thing. I mean, there's been composers like Bartok who use all these Romanian themes and all different themes as a basis, folk stuff.
Absolutely.
So that's there. Albert was just there's nothing to compare him to really, though. Really, his sound was like Gabriel's trumpet. It was huge. It was calling us all. And the thing is, I don't know where it's going to go from this point. I know that people who love the music and some who really play it beautifully and go on to their own thing. But in that point, I know that Train looked up to Albert. Train looked at Albert as somebody who could teach Train. It wasn't the other way around. I know that. That he really thought that Albert was like, I don't know if you call it, just not the. It's in the feeling like the Messiah. He was in the same. There was a way that we know that. That Bird was announcing a whole new era. it's interesting to me that Albert was that powerful, and yet for the world they don't know that he was there, but we know he's there, and you know he's there, and he's there, and I'm looking forward to everything's going digital now, and everything's going streaming, so we're gonna be. Yeah, it's gonna be streaming is screaming, man.
Yeah, Coltrane actually became a patron of Albert's and used to send him money when he to help him out a little bit, that's really a time when Coltrane's approach completely changed, and he went into stellar space and post ascension and all that. That was, he really got very much inspiration from Albert Ayler's playing, and told Bob Thiel that when he was sick, that at my funeral I want Albert Ayler to play and Ornette Coleman to play, and that's what happened.
That was pretty significant. In reference to that, I'd like to ask the both of you following Joel's admonishment not to harp on the bad aspect, but amongst the musicians community, what was the impact of the passings of John Coltrane and Albert Ayler? What was the general feeling amongst the musicians and the enthusiasts of the music? Not to stereotype how one should feel, but just in being that you're the actual primaries of that time, what do you remember being the feelings about amongst the musicians of Albert's untimely passing?
At that time?
Yeah.
At that point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, around the time of his unfortunate passing.
What was your feeling? You were just a little guy, though. You were...
Very young, yeah. I was born March 22nd of '68,
You were like...
Yeah, I know my father thought highly of Albert Ayler as well, and that's basically where I first heard
Your father's a
his
saxophone
records.
player.
Yes, he played alto, bass, clarinet, mostly local in the Brooklyn area. Had the honor of hanging out with Albert once in Prospect Park on the bench.
I'd
Sometime
say
around late '67 or something, but
it was different. It was different. Coltrane was, really accepted and established among the musicians. There were always some folks that would, say, Sonny Rollins was a better tenor player, and that they liked that style more. But basically, Coltrane was so revered in the jazz world that there was universal admiration and respect for him. When Albert passed, it was more, of confusion, sadness, anger, especially for those who thought that there had been some malfeasance. And, it just left a big void. But, Albert was never anywhere near established as Coltrane among, the musicians or the fans in the world.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The time is running on. I brought my axe here. I'd like to... You want...
we're going to do that right now. In fact, we're going to have a
just
brief...
as a little just a little hello memorial to say...
we were
you,
just going to
Albert.
get to that.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you.
Joel Friedman offered to play cello. Would you like me to join later?
Never, man, never. You can't join me. Of course, I'll join you, man. I'll join you.
All right.
Yeah,
This is a real honor. But what we're going to do now,
Look forward to it,
as
man.
as Joel is preparing, we're going to use that time to have a Q&A and to bring in our interactive aspect of the conversations
Jeez, I
and
need a
stuff.
pastrami sandwich. You don't have any?
Yeah. And so we're going to, the questions will, of course, facilitate more conversation. And we're going to play some music for you after we have a round of questions. So, Michael Moss, saxophone. Jeff Lederer, saxophone, is sitting next to him.
As I was telling Joel, for John Coltrane at St. Peter's Church was totally different from anything else I had ever heard, Ayler or anybody else do. Did that come from somewhere? Did that go anywhere? Were there other recordings of that kind of stuff that you did at, for John Coltrane like? Because I only heard that one piece ever on Impulse Records, and I'd love to hear more of it, but I've never found any more of it.
For John, live in Greenwich Village, yeah. Yeah. Would you like to sit, Nancy?
No, I'm not going to sit anymore, man. My legs are getting serious. I think there's a point where the music's got to say something. We miss these guys. They changed the music, changed my music, changed my head, and I miss Albert, and he'll always be there. And onward and upward, man. You got to keep doing it. And you keep doing your thing, man, because you really play the hell out of that horn.
Thank you, sir. Working on it. What's your answer, Steve?
I don't really have anything to add on that, but let's see if we have some more questions. We'll take the mic.
Joe, here's
I'm not good with the mic. Okay, so is this a good distance? Okay. I'd like to comment on how fitting it is that this sort of seminal 1970s concert was at the Foundation Mega, because it's in St. Paul de Venue, and that's a town where broke artists whose greatness was not yet recognized hung out. They paid for their meals at the local restaurant with paintings, and their names were Matisse and Picasso, and they were not yet recognized, and that's where they hung out.
Yeah, and Moreau.
Yeah.
And, well, what happened was when we played there, some of the local artists, there was an artist named Andre Verdet, and he gave us each some of his prints. But in the little town, the St. Paul de Vence is like on a mountain, like a big hill, and the Foundation was maybe a couple of miles away on another top of a mountain. But in the town of St. Paul de Vence itself, there was, you could see Miro's and Chagall's, and right there in every little restaurant. It wasn't just in galleries. So a lot of artists were active in that town. Or Andre Verdet had a lot of friends that were, Picasso and so forth, that were really artistically oriented. Amy Mick, who is, started the Foundation and created probably one of the biggest art centers in Europe to this day, was always very interested in the avant-garde side of the arts. So, it was right on the grounds. There were Calders, Mobiles. It was quite an artistic paradise.
20 years later.
Yeah.
I had no idea the history of jazz in that location.
Yeah.
I don't think they can, but yeah, you can do it right there.
All right, we're going to do a little bit of playing.
Yeah, but there's one more question as well.
One or two questions. So you mentioned that Rashid Ali is related to Muhammad Ali, which
Brothers.
Muhammad Ali played with Pharoah Sanders and winds up doing session work. He did a famous disco track.
Who are you referring to?
Muhammad Ali.
Rashid's brother, yeah.
Right. Oh, so they were related.
Brothers.
They were brothers, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I know that. And my next question is, during the times like the 1960s, jazz communities not only had different ideas and movements, but there was also like a communal type of thing that it was occurring, like you were saying,
Yeah.
in the Lower East Side.
Yeah,
And-
most of the musicians that were playing that music lived in apartments on the Lower East Side, everywhere from 3rd Avenue over to Avenue C, Avenue D, and in downtown Manhattan. So it really was a community. We used to just go and jam. I remember going to Pharoah Sanders' apartment and playing there, and there was just a lot of the musicians that lived in that area, and it was a communal type of experience because all the musicians got to play with each other and to jam. Plus, there were more places to play, especially in some of the clubs that you could jam in, but even more importantly, with the loft spaces that opened up, in which there was, formal concerts as well as rehearsals and a lot of jam sessions. So it was a totally different vibe at the time.
Very good, very good. Thank you.
Sure, I do. I mean, I could sit and talk about Albert all day, but I want to hear you guys play too. Here's a question that occurred to me. Hey, Steve, how are you? And it never occurred to me before this afternoon, but in addition to being an amazing improviser, Albert was an amazing composer. And while the tunes change a little bit from one version to another, they're remarkably consistent in some recordings. So I'm just wondering, maybe not at the point you were playing with Albert, do you know if Albert notated the compositions? Do you happen to know that?
He had lead sheets. I never saw any until, afterwards, until more recently. But he did have his music notated, but he didn't use it on the bandstand.
Sure.
And if you, unless you rehearsed with him, which was, I think, pretty rare, there were no use of written music to speak of. Maybe.
Well, and the second part of that is the scholarly part. Does anyone have any idea where the manuscripts are at this point for Albert's pieces?
Well, I don't know if they're not the manuscripts, I don't think, in most cases, but there is a lot of his music written out on the internet site. Jess Schwartz had long ago established early Albert Ayler website and blog, and now the most recent, very comprehensive website in England has a page with a bunch of the music on it.
Yeah, I didn't know. I hadn't seen that.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Great.
Yeah, we still are. Yeah, and that while Joel is getting ready, we'll have more discourse about Albert right now by asking Steve another question in reference to that time period. And Jeff Lederer, who was a modern devotee of Albert, just asked an important question about another question that concerns the music from that time period, because a lot of it was spontaneous. So do you find that there was no one set way of playing so-called free music at the time? Sometimes it was notated, sometimes it was spontaneous, or it could be a combination of all of those factors in one. You could lift it up.
Well, I would say that mostly at that time, free music was freely improvised. Some of the musicians that wrote tunes, had some music parts, sheet music, that was used as a reference point, but that was definitely not the norm. So it was mostly free improvisation with a few random themes brought in that maybe some of the individual musicians had, or if there was a band leader, might have had a few tunes set to play. But that's not the norm, Roz. It was what I was trying to do back in the mid to late '60s was meld the original compositions along with the free improvisation in a way that was structured but free at the same time. And to me, within composition, and there's every kind of style that you can think about within the greater category of jazz. For me, the most important thing in general is a strong melody. So that was one of the strengths of Albert's compositions. It wasn't just that they were simple original type folk tunes or based on some traditional tunes. It was very melodic. When you heard Albert Ayler's music, you could go away, you know, you don't even have to be a musician, just the average listener could go away and the tune would stay in their head, you know, because there were simple melodies, or strong melodies, I should say.
Right. Yeah. There was a whole totality of approaches to a lot of the breakthroughs of that time, not just one. Yeah, and you just outlined a very important factor, that there was still a connective thread running through the evolution of the music. And I think Joel is about to play a solo for us. And then, are you?
Nope, not ready yet.
Okay. And one more question from Michael Moss.
About the folk melodies, which folk melodies? I mean, were they coming from a particular part of the country, a particular musical tradition? What was the folk melody birthplace of
I'll tell you,
Albert?
Mike, I don't really know the origins. You know, I've read articles where a theme like Ghosts might have been related to something that was, you know, from a couple of centuries before, somewhere part of a folk theme. But that part of it, I'm really not that familiar with. You know, like I'll leave that to the music theorists. And
I think one of the themes is actually the French national anthem, which he definitely transformed that, because I mean the basis of that and the things that they were doing in the sociological sense, as far as the resources of the dark people of the world and all the plunder that was going on. I guess Albert used that as a transformative thing to make it a part of. He felt something was catchy in the melody in that regard, and then
they refer to it as La Mayonnaise.
Yeah, right. And another one, I think the song we know was Ghosts. And I mean, Jeff will probably know a lot of specifics about that too, if you care to join in and answer that yourself. Ghosts was a Swedish folk theme as well, right? A children's tune.
I'm not aware of that. That's actually really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also think Albert had a gift for writing melodies that were so deep that they sounded as if they were very,
Very
full.
good point.
They were his compositions.
Right.
Combination.
Yeah, it's on. So,
Let me just check it out.
yeah.
I think, Jeff, that's one of the things that I think a lot of really talented composers have in common, is that they can write original melodies that make you think about something else that sounds familiar, even though it's totally original.
And right now, what Steve said was perfect, because it's going to lead into a solo cello by Joe Friedman, and then we'll join in.
Can you hear this out there?
We can hear you.
I can't hear I need my special.
It's coming through.
We have folk melodies, huh? Oh, God. I'm going to start with the folk melody. Okay, for Albert.
Dear Albert, Albert Ayler, the other one.
For Albert.
Susan, what time is it? 6:22. We got time. You want to play more? Huh? I'm good, man. You good? You want to play more? No. Are you cool? Okay. I think we know we'll salute. Yeah, you know, we still have some time left before the closing of this conversation, this latest installation of Jazz and Self-Determination, which briefly, before we get back to Albert, this is the third one here at the People's Forum in an ongoing series of panel discussions focusing on the sociological and artistic components of the free jazz, avant-garde jazz revolution of the 1960s, where, well, not just one era, but the participants in that particular expression come and define a narrative in reference to whatever was or whatever wasn't, instead of it being done by way of, you know. So, but this just so happens that the next discussion fell on July 13th, and it would be a good idea, especially in such a great functional and constructive space as the People's Forum, to facilitate a conversation about one of the progenitors of consciousness in music, Mr. Albert Ayler, who would be, Steve said, 83 years young today.
He would be 83, yeah.
And Steve Tintweiss and Joel Friedman played with Albert live in performance and as far as recordings. And of course, that discussion is inclusive of a larger conversation about the free jazz history from that time and all the different aspects within that.
Ross, tell us about your classes that are coming up here on
Yeah, and
jazz and self-determination.
the
That'll be right here.
discussions are usually a follow-up for class. The discussions are usually a kickoff for classes that follow, also with the jazz and self-determination title, where I have presenters come in to present similar to what we did today with the discussion. It is the same kind of approach, transforming the educational approach or extending the educational approach and the learning experience concept of the educational approach, where people involved in music come and present. And Aurora Flores will be blessing our class the 15th from 6 to 9. She is a journalist, first woman journalist in the world of Latin Afro-Cuban music, and composer, organizer, and journalist Aurora Flores. So don't miss that. Right upstairs from 6 to 9. Of course, by the time this goes out, it'll be an expanded time. But and Wednesday, July 24th, we'll be blessed with the presence of Professor Patricia Spears Jones, who will share her recollections of the loft era of the 1970s as a poet, as a listener and enthusiast. And she will make a presentation to the class on Wednesday, July 24th from 6 to 9. And coming up in the future speakers for the classes in September and October are Mariposa Fernandez and Stephen Equa Colson, Amina Claudine Myers, and trying to get Martina Roberts and other people around who can really make a positive contribution. So we're going to continue the last of our conversation by Albert, and I'm going to let the real people who knew Albert say whatever they have to say in closing,
Yeah,
unless
but
there's
Russ,
any other questions.
Just an announcement, just as a reminder, that while this is streaming live over the internet, it is being recorded so that anyone who wants to watch parts of it or in its entirety can go to YouTube, People's Forum on YouTube, and you'll be able to find this and all the other sessions that you've done. And we really look forward. I look forward myself to hearing it tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd like to give a thanks to the tech worker here at People's Forum and everybody that keeps it running in general, the staff and everyone who is responsible for facilitating this great series of discussions, politically, culturally, artistically, which is much needed in this time period especially. So big shout to everyone. So what were your final feelings about Albert, Steve, and Joel?
Well, of course, his influence is felt among so many of the music in general. I think Albert once said in an interview, and when it was at the height of its controversy, the style of music that he was exploring, that this is the only way that musicians can play now if everything else has been done before. And if people don't like it now, they will in the future. So that was a very optimistic attitude that Albert had.
One day everything will be as it should be, right?
Yeah, right. So
One of the things is that, to me, when I just one speaker. Okay, you would cut me off, right, man? Yeah. The bottom line is that I think that music is for everybody, and I think that, to me, the only question was, can I talk? No, there we go. We got to get some lavas, man, lavaliers, you know. To me, the bebop kind of thing is, some people play it really, really well. Some people are incredible at it. In fact, some people should be playing it. But most people, I don't know, to me, the bebop kind of thing is a wonderful way of playing. But to me, personally, it's passé for me. I'm not talking about for everybody else. It just is not as interesting. I played bass. I can play the chord changes. I can play all that stuff, and the bebop. But playing free is much more interesting, and it works or it doesn't work. It's good or it's not good. It's a hit and miss thing sometimes. You try to work your way around things, but it's exploratory. It's inventive, and I think to me it's more personally more inventive than the bebop stuff that I've heard. I think that I've heard those songs, the tunes. Bird plays them great. Diz plays them great. Man, those cats. I mean, come on. And Miles and Train. What more I can't add more to that. I don't. It's impossible for me to do that.
Well, this is like recreating. That happens to a lot of styles of music. You got the retro swing band music. You've got neo beboppers. You've got free jazz players that are recreating what was done, 50 years ago. So, you have to be careful not to fall into music as a museum piece. And I think that gets to what you're talking about. Bebop, for me, was a great way to learn your skills and your technique on your instrument, going back to the early days of the loft jazz scene, which was spearheaded by Studio Wee in the late 60s and early 70s. There was music going there, probably 18, 19 hours a day, around the clock, and there were some free jazz players there, but it was mostly some hardcore beboppers, people like C Sharp, Tommy Turrentine, Gilly Coggins, and so James Du Bois, who had led Studio Wee and formed it and directed it, was gave an opportunity for a lot of musicians to come and play with some really seasoned great players that there's no way that you could have played for a few hours with those guys and not developed your technique. But they were strictly changes, tunes, bebop style. But that was a great way to get your technique, like studying classical music. But to your point, Joel, a lot of what is going on now is sort of a recreation. It's not the real thing. It's you hear the difference if you listen to free jazz from 40, 50 years ago. You listen to bebop from 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Folks are playing in that style now, but it's certainly not the same. And other styles of jazz that have formulated, because jazz can be the seed for so many different kinds of music across the realm of blues and pop and chamber music, everything in between. The thing that is most difficult to find and look out for is those true original pioneers that really have something completely new to say in their own way, in an original style, and that's the type of thing that's still so very rare.
Well, I think we should do about 3 or 4 cover songs now. Let's do some covers, I'm kidding around. Look, not to knock anybody else, but I have a friend who he's playing. He's a terrific player. He's got a lot of technique, but he's playing a lot of cover songs. And eventually, he said, "Hey, come on with me, man. I'm playing playing parties. I'm playing bar mitzvahs and all of that." Yes, man, I know that. and I don't want to do that. I did that when I was 15. So, look, you find your own level of stuff, not to knock anybody. You just, you know, I mean, I couldn't even begin to come near Albert, wouldn't even want to, nor Train. I mean, these guys are giants, you know, but you can learn stuff from them because the thing with Train is when I first caught Train, and it was at the Village Gate too, he first broke off from, didn't break off, he was with Miles after that, but he had started his own group. And and the place was pretty well filled. And he started to play Summertime. And he played Summertime for an hour and 10 minutes. I mean, and everybody was glued. I mean, he was just sweating and sweating and sweating. Now, nobody had done that, say, Summertime for like 70 minutes, 71 actually. It broke the ground. You got to change things. And he changed things. I'm not out to change that. I mean, sometimes you have, you know, some genius that appears. He happened to be that. He worked at it. He worked very hard at it, and he deserved where he got. And Albert did too.
And Albert also played Summertime on a number of occasions. That was one of the few standards that he would go to
That's
he
right.
liked to play. I had the pleasure on our last set at the Village
Right.
Turisme after the Make Foundation
Right.
concerts. After my battery had run out, so it didn't get recorded, we did a version of Summertime.
Blew you
It
away
was a
too.
lot of fun.
Albert was outrageous.
Yeah, and I got to actually sing on it. So.
But he took another it takes another level. What we want to try in music is to move. What I like to do anyway. I can't tell what anybody else. Just I like to try to push the envelope. Sometimes I do it well. Sometimes it sucks. I'll admit to it. There's some music I do that I just am not happy about, and not like the way I improvised. But then I could try it again, and then, that's it more. Now you kind of start something, you try it. Maybe it's not the greatest, but it leads you to the next place and leads you to the next place. And you have to kind of reflect on it and be honest with yourself about it. With cello, I have, like, for example, there was the great Soviet cellist, Rusty. And Rusty, he decided, it was in the mid to late 40s, he was around the 50s actually, he was going to record the Bach suites. The Bach suites are the standard literature for a cellist. And, you know, to get through those, you have to be pretty achieving top. So here's a top guy, the top of the world, from the Moscow Conservatory all the way along the line. And he records it. And he thinks he's doing a good job. And he listens back to it, and he freaks out because he realized that he didn't even come near achieving what he wanted to achieve, or anything near what Bach really wanted. He said he realized he was way off base. He bought back all the records, took all his money, bought it back, and destroyed them. And so we'll never hear that. He said, "The hell with that. I didn't know what I was doing," and he was honest enough to that. Well, maybe we're not. I mean, tell Bob Thiel, the old Bob Thiel, hey, we're going to rip up the recording man. But you know.
Yeah. So, and what you feel that the bebop, that initial revolution in music, you feel that the progenitors of that had more creativity than what was to come later, as far as the rehashes?
I would say if you rehash something, that's what it is. It's not the original. And, you know, I mean, who could say anything? I mean, you're talking about Bird. You're talking about Sonny Rollins. He didn't rehash stuff. He created his own style, his own thing. Was it as great as Train? To me, Train was really something. But then to Train, Albert was really something. And who is next? I don't know who's next, really. Maybe this man is sitting here looking at me, running this forum. We don't know. He's going to hit something next, because he's reaching out that way. And I hope you do reach that ring and do it well, man, because you're on that.
I appreciate it, working on it all the time. And you know what, and were you going to say something, Steve?
Well, along the same lines, it's what you're doing, Ross, is, you know, you're doing what some of today's musicians have been developing that really is a new phenomenon, and that's becoming, you know, not just a musician, but a presenter, a producer, and an organizer within the community of musicians that makes a big difference, because it's certainly not an economic field that that's supportive. There's the old system of the big record labels that musicians would look to get a contract with for their career development and for their survival. That no longer exists now. With the ability to put out your own music and stream it on the internet, it's not about the money, because there just basically isn't any for this kind of music. But
I don't know, man. I'll take the money, man. Speak for
Well,
yourself, man.
Creative
Well, there is none,
visualization.
so-
Speak for yourself, man. I'll take that 25
some of the
cents.
biggest names that we know might have some very, millions of hits on the internet, and they'll get a check from Spotify for, $6.58 after 3
And,
months, and 2 million plays. So
That's a future
yeah.
plan, is a discussion about the economics alone
Yeah,
of what we do, because it's intertwined with the larger environmental factors and sociological factors with people who create music as workers of art, and intertwined with that whole saga and the development of people from collectives into wage laborers into what we have now with the embracing of a lot of reactionary things, But in reference to that, Joe, because you make films too, and
That's right.
tell us, the premise of that, because I know you've done a lot of films about the indigenous American.
Yeah, I have. I have done a lot of that. I went to NYU Film School, and that was some years back, and I was pulled into it by a friend of mine who became a terrific photographer and my cameraman for a long time. And he later on, Bob Fiore later worked for Brian De Palma and Marty Scorsese and so on. In fact, I'm going to toot my own horn. It's not. I just happened. Marty Scorsese edited the first film I ever made, so that was but it was film school. And you know what? In a way, that's cool. You think, wow, isn't that something? But Marty didn't think about it. He just wanted to do it. And in a way, at a certain point, like in the film business, and I went to Hollywood for a while. I did some Hollywood films, but the main thing is people get up in the morning. They gotta brush their teeth and shave and all that stuff. Just like it doesn't matter who you are.
That's right.
And we're all human beings now. And I think that the idea of making films, though, is really, for me, I moved into documentary a long time ago. But documentaries tell the truth if you're doing it a certain way. You can go to see some of my films. What they are, they mainly go to institutions like colleges, universities, government agencies, whatever. They show in theaters and so on. You can go to WeMakeMovies.com. And the prices.
MakeMovies.com. And the films that you made were about the indigenous.
They're about
American
indigenous
population.
people. I made, starting off, Phil Messina and myself made a film called Ski-Zag, which is kind of prison Latin for skag. It became one of the top anti-drug film ever in the world. It's still circulating. It's still in progress. Still out there. I'm interested in doing social films that help people. Our indigenous people, the Shoshone people, the Paiute people, all these people who are indigenous they are still being harassed and hassled by the U.S. government, who still continues to take their lands. So the films are about their struggle. And I think they should be, I'm doing a film now called Simply Cello. And it's a documentary. And I'm not sure the direction it's taking, but I think that there is a direction on it, which ties in with our music, which is I have a few top people who I teach, and people from one person from the Moscow Conservatory, and she got uptight. In fact, about this person didn't want to be shown in the film until she had perfected the piece that she thought she had to perfect. And I said, though, and the idea of this film, though, it's about process, about the process of making music, why you make choices, when you practice it, not judging the quality of the piece. Because music is always that, isn't it? You're always in process. You're always developing it. Like I was saying before, there's some things you like, some things you don't like. But that's the process of growing. And if you like everything, then the hell with it. I mean, there's no point in doing it. So the film Cello is about, my philosophy is cello is a way of life. It is a way of life. I don't feel very Zen-like about it, just as a way of life. If you approach it a certain way, to look at it and say, I can learn from this, it's going to teach me something. And it's not necessarily a question of being, there are cellists who are brilliant, I mean, and they're, like Yo-Yo Ma is a fantastic cellist, we all know this. But he plays everything. He plays jazz, he plays every type of music you want to think, jazz. He plays Bach, he plays pop music, he plays samba. He does everything. That's a very creative person. He's not afraid to go forward. So the main thing is, I think you just have to learn how to drop your fears.
He even improvises.
And that's right. He does improvise. And you know, of course, Bach was the great improviser. You know that. He was the ultimate improviser. He wrote these things and you want to improvise. One of my young cellists in the film, who started studying with me when she was about 6 years old, she's now a professional cellist. And I said, would you mind just play something and we'll shoot you with the camera. We did. It's nice because you have digital stuff. You have high-end digital cameras.
Yeah.
You couldn't do it before. Well, I said, so she played some Bach, and I said, what does that do for you? She says, well, the thing about Bach is he was such an improviser. Every time I play the suites or play one of the suites, I'm learning something new. It's like it's a fresh thing. I'm doing it again, and it's all brand new. It seems like it's like breaking new ground every time. She says, it's really beautiful. Well, you know, I think that's the thing. I didn't mean to sound hoity-toity about, I don't like I love bebop, I love Bird, I love Diz, I love all of man, they got me into music. It's just a direction of music that I've taken that I like for myself, not judging it for anybody else.
Well, you know,
so if I seem like really like a kind of a music racist, watch out, man. I'm not. I just want to
Okay.
grow.
What you're doing
All right.
gets
So,
into the
uh,
role of media. You know, the media of today and the audiences just in general, you know, they need to have the visual element.
Right.
And I think the future of presenting the music is going to be very dependent on visual media. In terms of not only audio quality, but the visual aspect of it. I think that's very important to maintain an audience or even to try to build on audiences. And it's not only in music. I mean, it's true about everything that's happening today. You know, people don't read the Mueller report, but if they saw a movie of it, you know, narrated by you know, really rich voices that
We're gonna
would
have
make
a
a
Mueller
big
report
difference.
though next week or whatever it is. They're gonna have a real
Yeah.
narrated by, and we'll see what happens.
Well, that's
Yeah,
it's
we'll
gonna
see
be
what
drama.
happens.
That's all we'll just
Right
see.
on. And you know, Steve, you were a producer of shows as well, and
Yeah, I produce park concerts throughout the city, and especially in Forest Park in Queens for almost 30 years. And it's very difficult because, you know, it takes a lot of time away from developing your art, and especially if you're dealing with trying to get grant funds and so forth. You know, it's a whole other field of arts administration. But even production on the commercial level, you know, it's good to, as a producer, you get to see the level above. It's like you can see the picture from a higher level and put the pieces together and perhaps make it a little more varied and interesting to try to, you know, keep the audience and maybe try to stretch out their attention span, which is unfortunately very short. People are just used to short sound bites these days.
right, absolutely. And so to close, because we're winding down, it's almost 7 o'clock, and your last assessments of what Albert Ayler means to the both of you to close on his birthday.
it's his birthday. Happy birthday, Albert. We can feel your presence, man. It's a lot of beautiful light that he. Oh, I'm sorry. Albert's a beautiful guy. Albert still lives. You say he lives. He lives. You hear the music. You know, when you were playing it, it was a great thrill, and it's still a great thrill. And I hope it's for for everybody. So hopefully it'll get out further and further. His albums will be played more and more. He'll be recognized, and he would want you to enjoy the music, and that's the key thing. He's changed my life, that's for sure. Hey, Joe, I be Albert, he said. Hey, Mr. Ayler, it's a pleasure. Yeah, now, where are we going to practice? So let's go down. How about over there? Let's sit on that garbage can down there. That's a good place to go. And it was a great place to go, man. Love the man. Still do, always will.
And I guess we got to keep in mind today on Albert Ayler's birthday that there's not too many of us left, the Albert Ayler alumnus that actually played with him or were in his bands. Really not too many of us left right now. So, you know, there are still, of course, people that did get to hear him live. But there's not a whole lot of his music that hasn't come out. You know, there are probably still some things that are in the can, maybe not the greatest recording quality, but you know, his influence still is growing because you know, he's now commonly accepted as one of the, you know, pioneers of the new music, of the new jazz, and you know,
rightfully so.
He's one of the major figures, and so a lot of people are just discovering him for the first time. But it's really up to those who are, you know, the young people now that are maybe studying in a jazz program in colleges. This needs to be emphasized or introduced because, believe it or not, there's a lot of young musicians, and especially in America, who want to be professional jazz musicians and study diligently and practice on their instrument and, you know, learn everything they can, even about, you know, recording in the business and promotion, that don't really know who Albert Ayler was. So we've got to keep at it. We've got to get the radio stations to play more of his music, especially on a day like today. And, you know, the music will speak for itself.
Thank you. And on that note, and on all the many notes that Albert played, we thank this brother on his birthday, and we thank the People's Forum for facilitating another great conversation. Look out for Sonny Simmons coming up on August 31st, and he will be here talking about his life. So this has been another edition of Jazz and Self-Determination with Steve Tintweiss on bass. Bassist playing melodica today. And filmmaker, cellist, educator, Joel Friedman.
And I want to thank everybody for coming and listening and taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ross.
So stay tuned and be sure to tune in to www.peoplesforum.org for their programming in general and stay acquainted with what's happening, okay? All right.
All right. All right. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Ross. I want to thank you, man.
Right on. Thank you, too.
You're the greatest, man. And Steve, we've rehooked, man. We're hooked up again. It's great. We're going to be doing some stuff.
I